A drama unfolded in a quiet suburb that shocked even seasoned investigators. A man, fascinated by a secret affair with his aunt, was unable to control his obsession. In a fit of rage, he cold-bloodedly murdered his wife, and then his aunt herself, causing a bloody tragedy. The events leading to the double murder took place in a small town in the American Midwest. There, a married couple, Jonathan Miller and his wife, Sarah, lived in an ordinary house. At first glance, they were an unremarkable family. Jonathan worked in the service industry. Sarah took care of the house and worked part-time at the local library. Neighbors knew them, calm, outwardly friendly, and without open conflict. But behind the facade of ordinary life lurked a tense atmosphere that no one suspected. Jonathan had a complicated relationship with his family from childhood. His parents were often absent from home, and his maternal aunt, Rebecca, largely handled his upbringing. She was only 10 years older than him, and as a teenager, Jonathan saw her not only as a relative but also as an object of attraction. As he grew older, he increasingly idealized her, harboring feelings that remained hidden. When Jonathan married, the connection with his aunt didn't end. On the contrary, it gradually became intimate. Sarah suspected something was wrong in their marriage. She noticed frequent phone calls and meetings between her husband and Rebecca, which had no apparent reason. Attempts to clarify the situation led to arguments. Jonathan avoided direct answers and sometimes reacted aggressively. Neighbors reported hearing screams in the house with increasing frequency in the months leading up to the tragedy. Jonathan and Rebecca's intimate relationship was kept secret. They met in secluded places, sometimes even at the family home when Sarah was away. Their relationship was unstable. Rebecca had doubts, understood that what was happening was unacceptable, but continued to succumb to her nephew's influence. For Jonathan, the relationship became an obsession. He increasingly distanced himself from his wife, focusing entirely on his aunt. Over time, tensions within the family increased. Sarah tried to save the marriage, hoping the situation would clear up. She repeatedly turned to friends for advice, expressed her suspicions, but didn't reveal the whole truth. Many around the couple dismissed their relationship as merely struggling. No one could have predicted that the drama hidden behind closed doors would escalate into violence. A significant factor was Jonathan's addiction to alcohol. He drank increasingly frequently, especially after arguments. Under the influence of alcohol, his irritability increased. At such moments, he became unpredictable. It was then that he made threats against Sarah, but she dismissed them, believing them to be mere words spoken while intoxicated. As the tragedy approached, the threesome's relationship reached a dead end. Rebecca tried to end the relationship, realizing its devastating consequences. But Jonathan had no intention of giving up on her. His obsession became total. He convinced his aunt that they should be together, that his wife was only getting in the way of their happiness. His words increasingly echoed ideas of removing the barrier. The family's immediate surroundings were unaware of what was happening. Neither the police nor social services received any reports of violence. Outwardly, the family remained part of a peaceful neighborhood. But in reality, this period proved critical. A secret intimate relationship, arguments, and the husband's aggressive behavior laid the groundwork for the future crime. By the time of the tragedy, Jonathan had completely lost control. His behavior became increasingly obsessive and threatening. For Sarah, this meant a constant feeling of fear, though she continued to live in hope that things would change. For Rebecca, her connection with her nephew had become a trap from which she could not escape. All three found themselves in a situation that was inevitably heading toward a bloody end. After the first few years of Jonathan and Sarah's marriage, the outward calm began to gradually crumble. The secret relationship between him and his Aunt Rebecca became increasingly less secret. At first, these were rare meetings justified by shared family matters, but over time they evolved into regular dates. Jonathan became increasingly immersed in this relationship and lost interest in his own wife. For Rebecca, the situation presented an internal conflict. On the one hand, she understood that her relationship with her nephew was crossing all boundaries and destroying families. On the other, she felt dependent on him. Jonathan exerted psychological pressure on her. He spoke of devotion, of how he couldn't live without her, that their relationship was predestined. Over time, this obsession became his sole reason for existing. Sarah began to notice changes in her husband's behavior. He began spending more time away from home, blaming it on work or meeting friends. Messages, which he hid, began appearing on his phone more and more often. One day, Sarah noticed a text message with Rebecca and demanded an explanation. Jonathan didn't deny the contact, but dismissed it as normal family communication. The argument culminated in shouting and a fight, but Sarah decided not to escalate the situation further. Meanwhile, Jonathan's self-control was increasingly slipping. Alcohol became an increasingly common feature of his life. While intoxicated, he would call his aunt at night, demanding meetings. Rebecca tried to distance herself, realizing the situation was becoming dangerous, but she always succumbed to the pressure. She feared publicity and, at the same time, was unable to abandon a man who had become an emotional dependency. Tensions were mounting between Sarah and Jonathan. Sarah noticed his aggressive outbursts, especially when she asked direct questions about his fidelity. Jonathan responded with harsh words, sometimes threatening that he couldn't live without Rebecca. Such statements heightened her anxiety. She shared her suspicions with close friends several times, but never mentioned Rebecca directly. At the same time, Jonathan began to think that the only way out was to remove the obstacle. In his perception, his wife had become a figure who stood in the way of true feelings. He imagined a life solely with his aunt, free from scandals and suspicions. However, the very fact of family ties, secrecy, and public condemnation created a double pressure for him. Rebecca sensed danger, but she didn't take any decisive steps. She was afraid to admit what was happening to anyone. Sometimes she told Jonathan they needed to end their relationship, but each time this led to fresh outbursts of rage. He insisted that no one should interfere, and that his wife would leave sooner or later. The situation became increasingly isolated. Sarah tried to keep the family together, hoping for change. She suggested her husband seek help from a psychologist, but he refused. He was irritated by any mention of problems. He became increasingly distant, spending time outside the home, and sometimes disappearing for entire days. As the tragic events approached, Rebecca began to openly express doubts. She felt the relationship had gone too far and suggested they stop seeing each other. But this decision only further intensified Jonathan's obsession. He began insisting that they must be together at any cost. His words became increasingly aggressive. He accused his aunt of betrayal, demanding that she choose. Those around them continued to consider their family ordinary. Neither neighbors nor colleagues knew about their secret connections. Everything took place within the closed circle of 3 people. From the outside, the family home looked familiar, but behind its walls, tension was growing, and it could no longer be contained. By spring, the relationship had spiraled completely out of control. Jonathan increasingly spoke of how they couldn't be together without radical action. He began making plans and discussing with Rebecca a new life without Sarah. His words ceased to be abstract threats and became concrete scenarios. It was during this period that the tragic end, which would change the lives of all 3, began to unfold. The night of the tragedy came suddenly, although the warning signs were clear. Jonathan increasingly spoke of taking decisive action, and his words were no longer mere threats. On the day of the murder, he had been drinking more than usual. According to neighbors, he was seen outside the house that evening with a bottle of beer in his hand, and even then he seemed agitated and irritated. Sarah was at home, preparing dinner. At that moment, Rebecca arrived, trying to talk to her nephew and stop the escalating conflict. The threesome's conversation quickly devolved into an argument. Sarah accused her husband of infidelity, this time openly and directly naming her aunt. Rebecca didn't deny the affair. The atmosphere became tense. Jonathan shouted, accusing both women of not understanding him and betraying him. Sarah demanded an immediate end to the relationship and suggested Jonathan move out if he couldn't keep the family together. It was at this moment that his aggression turned into action. According to the investigation, Jonathan grabbed a kitchen knife lying on the table. His first blow stabbed Sarah. She tried to break free and screamed, but the blows continued. Her body was found in the kitchen with multiple stab wounds. Forensic experts concluded that death occurred almost instantly, but the struggle continued for several seconds, as evidenced by traces of blood on the floor and furniture. Rebecca witnessed the murder. Panicked, she tried to flee the house, but Jonathan caught up with her in the hallway. He shouted that she had no right to leave him, that they would be together now. During the struggle, he stabbed her several times with the same knife. According to investigators, the nature of the wounds indicated rage. The blows were chaotic and inflicted with particular force. Rebecca collapsed at the front door, unable to leave the house. After the murder, silence fell in the house. Jonathan sat for a while next to the bodies. He later admitted to smoking and drinking alcohol, trying to process what had happened. He made no attempt to cover up the crime or dispose of evidence. On the contrary, he remained in the house for several more hours. Neighbors reported hearing loud screams around 9 o'clock in the evening, but no one called the police immediately. The family had a history of similar disputes. The bodies weren't discovered until the morning. Officially, a neighbor noticed the door to the house open and signs of disorder visible through the window. He called the police. Arriving officers found a bloody scene inside. The kitchen and hallway were covered in blood, and the bodies of 2 women lay on the floor. Jonathan was found on the couch in the living room, heavily intoxicated. He offered no resistance when arrested. During later interrogation, the man claimed he didn't remember the details. However, an examination revealed that, despite his intoxication, his actions were consistent and purposeful. Investigators noted that the blows were inflicted with clear intent to kill. His fingerprints were found on the murder weapon in the house, as well as blood stains on his clothing. The investigation established that the crime occurred amid a long-running conflict related to an intimate relationship between Jonathan and his aunt. Investigators concluded that the murder occurred as a sudden outburst of aggression, but was internally planned. The man had previously made threats and had thoughts of eliminating his wife. The news came as a shock to those around them. Neighbors told reporters they never imagined such an outcome. All 3 seemed like ordinary people, although the quarrels in the house sometimes attracted attention. But no one expected the bloody outcome. That evening, tragedy tore 2 lives apart and left a deep mark on the small community. Jonathan's obsession escalated into actions that could not be reversed. The murder of his wife and aunt was the culmination of a destructive relationship, hidden from public view, but long festering. Police arrived at the scene that morning after a neighbor called. An examination revealed a scene of brutal violence. Sarah's body, with multiple stab wounds, lay in the kitchen, and Rebecca's body, also showing signs of struggle, was by the front door. Blood trails led from the kitchen to the hallway, confirming the sequence of the perpetrator's actions. Jonathan was detained at the house. He was heavily intoxicated at the time of his arrest, but remained responsive. He was taken to the station, where the initial interrogations began. He claimed to have no memory of the circumstances and was unaware of what had happened. However, investigators immediately noted that the lack of any attempt to escape indicated a unique psychological state. He remained near the bodies for several hours without taking any steps to cover his tracks. The examination revealed that Sarah had been stabbed at least 10 times, most of them in the chest. Rebecca had been stabbed 7 times, some of which were in the neck. Marks on both victims' hands indicated attempts to resist. Forensic experts concluded that both women died quickly, but the struggle lasted only a few seconds. The murder weapon, a kitchen knife covered in Jonathan's blood and fingerprints, was seized from the house. Traces of DNA from both victims were found on his clothing. All the evidence clearly pointed to his involvement. Investigators also examined the background. Neighbors, acquaintances, and colleagues were interviewed. Many confirmed that conflicts had been occurring in the family in recent months, with arguments and shouting being heard. A close friend of Sarah's told police that she had suspected her husband of having an affair with her aunt, but had been hesitant to speak up. Rebecca received special attention. A review of her phone records revealed intimate messages from Jonathan. This information confirmed the connection between them. The investigation established that this factor was key to the motive for the crime. During interrogation, Jonathan behaved inconsistently. At times, he admitted to committing the murder, blaming it on jealousy and the pressure of circumstances. At other times, he claimed he remembered nothing. A forensic psychiatric examination found him sane. Despite his emotional state and alcohol intoxication, he was aware of his actions and controlled them. The investigation concluded quickly. Evidence, witness testimony, and expert opinions left no doubt as to Jonathan's guilt. The prosecutor filed charges of double murder with particular cruelty. Jonathan Miller's trial began several months after the investigation concluded. The courtroom was filled with media representatives, relatives of the victims, and local residents shocked by the tragedy. The case generated widespread interest because it involved a double murder resulting from an illicit affair within a family. The prosecution presented materials collected during the investigation, forensic examinations, witness statements, and evidence of intimate correspondence between Jonathan and Rebecca. The prosecutor emphasized that the crime was not random, but the result of a long-term obsession and deliberate choice. The defense attorney centered his case on the defendant's emotional instability and alcohol intoxication. He insisted the murder was committed in a state of passion and that Jonathan had no premeditated intentions. However, the evidence presented showed that he repeatedly stated that his wife was interfering with his relationship with his aunt and threatened to eliminate her. Sarah's relatives testified at the hearing. Her sister recounted her final conversations, in which the deceased complained about her husband's behavior and expressed fear for her life. This provided the court with important evidence that the threats were genuine and not a sudden outburst of emotion. Jonathan himself gave conflicting testimony. At one hearing, he admitted killing his wife and aunt, blaming it on jealousy and an inability to control himself. At another, he claimed he couldn't remember the details. A forensic psychiatric examination confirmed his sanity, ruling out the possibility of a reduced sentence based on insanity. After several weeks of deliberations, the jury returned a guilty verdict. The court found Jonathan guilty of 2 counts of aggravated murder. The sentence was life imprisonment without parole. The public reaction was unanimous. Local newspapers reported a shocking crime in a quiet neighborhood. Residents said they had never noticed Jonathan's violent tendencies, and only after the publicity came to light did they begin to recall the screams and arguments. The tragedy's aftermath also affected Rebecca's family. They refused to comment on her role in the events, preferring to hide from the press. For them, this story represented a double loss. They lost their daughter and gained a murderous relative. The case was resolved, but its aftermath continued to be discussed in the city for a long time. For many, it became an example of how hidden family conflicts can lead to catastrophic consequences if not intervened promptly.